Okay. Hello, my name is Marek Tatała, and I am Vice President of the Civil Development Forum. Our next guest at the Freedom Games is Johan Norberg. Unfortunately, we are unable to talk in Łódź, in Poland, where the Freedom Games usually take place, but thanks to digital technologies and human progress, we are able to have this conversation online. I am in Warsaw, and our guest, who is Swedish, joined us today from Stockholm. Johan Norberg is an author, lecturer, filmmaker, and historian of ideas. He is senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., and his books have been translated into 25 languages, including Polish. Some of you may know Johan because of his previous book that was translated into Polish, Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future, which was an international bestseller, and it was published by Fior Publishing. You can find this book online and buy the Polish edition. But today we are meeting because of Johan's new book entitled Open, The Story of Human Progress. Johan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marek. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to Human Progress that makes it possible for us to do this under the circumstances.
When I started reading Open, my initial thought was that it will be kind of part 2 of Progress. But after I read this book, I think it can be also treated as a kind of part 0, a prequel of Progress. So where are your thoughts on this? And what is the connection between these two books? The first that was published in Poland and the second that is now available, for example, on Amazon and other places where you can buy it.
Yeah, I think you read the book exactly right. The way I think of it is that the Progress book was like the classic Star Wars trilogy in a way. And this is both the prequel and the sequel. So this is what happened before and what's going to happen after the classic trilogy. Only hopefully better than the Star Wars prequel and sequel. Because Progress was about all the improvements in science, technology, and business that makes our world better than it's ever been before when you look at an objective reading of indicators of human well-being. But it didn't tell the story about how did we get there? What are the foundations, the pillars that make human progress possible? So that's what Open does. But it also explained why it's often threatened historically and today and possibly in the future as well, because where openness creates progress. But unfortunately, we're often very uncomfortable with openness and the lack of predictability and safety that we think it gives. So in a way, it's both my explanation of why openness is necessary, but also a warning not to take it for granted, but of course it is constantly under threat.
The story that you are telling in the book seems to me very universal. Modern Poland is definitely one of the examples of success and progress after transition in 1989 and the fall of communism. But there were some people in the 80s who were claiming that after over 40 years of communism, Poles are unable to participate in free exchange and free enterprise, speaking about so-called Homo Sovieticus developed in Poland. It was obviously not true. And when, thanks to free market reforms, the system became more open again, the entrepreneurship started to flourish in Poland. And in your book, you give a lot of examples of periods of progress and openness in various cultures and various religions. So do you agree that openness that leads to progress is not only the Western world phenomenon?
Yes, and I think this is an incredibly important point because we often read history backwards. We start with what we have now, and then we try to find any kind of clue as to why we got here. And that often makes us blind to how universal the story of openness and progress can be. You know, when development economists thought about what makes modern industrial civilization with high living standards possible and liberal democracy possible, they started by saying, oh, it only happens in a few modern Protestant economies in Northwestern Europe, because you know it started in the Netherlands and Great Britain and Nordic countries. It couldn't happen, they said, in Catholic countries, because thus far it hadn't. And as late as the 1970s, we had fascist dictatorships in Latin America, Spain, Portugal. We had communism in Poland. But then the moment these countries began to get, these populations got some freedom to prove their ability, their energy, their innovation, we saw progress there as well. Then people started saying, yes, but it only happens in Christian places. It's not possible, for example, in Asian cultures. But then we got South Korea, we got Taiwan. Later on, when China started to open up its economy, we saw rapid economic development there as well. So I think it's incredibly important not to try to limit this to any kind of story about an ethnicity, a particular belief, a particular culture. The one thing, when you look at historical periods of golden eras of rapid scientific improvement, technological innovation, and economic progress, the one common denominator is that they have been open to various influences from new places, using learning skills, ideas, good technologies, and importing goods and services from other cultures and other ethnicities as well. Those cultures who did that and gave their populations a certain freedom to experiment in new, strange ways, both in business and in science and in free speech. They created golden eras. So it's about openness. It's not about where you happen to come from. It's where you're heading.
I agree, and I think what you said about how we look at the history is also connected with education. My impression from my experience when I was at school was that the history was very first, focus on Poland and then focus on Europe and maybe United States. From the book, I learned, for example, many interesting things about the Muslim culture and how open it was in some periods of time, how inventive were people in Muslim countries, which is, I think, contradictory to many stereotypes that we have today about this culture, for example. On the topic, one of the topic of your book is open exchange, which is, of course, related to free trade and globalization. Today, we know the results of the presidential elections in the United States, and while Joe Biden was definitely not a perfect candidate for many classical liberals in America and the rest of the world, one hope that he is giving to many people
Wi-Fi connection. Wouldn't that be great? And if everybody had a machine like that, it would help everybody. The farmer who's very good at producing food could put food in the machine and in exchange get the, say, irrigation systems or clothes that he's not able to produce for himself. That would be without a doubt the best machine that had ever been invented, and it would create progress for produce whatever we've got, and in exchange we can get all the things we need. So it's a way to not being generous and warm and fuzzy. It's about self-interest. It's about making your own skills, your own work more valuable, because you can specialize in what you do best, and then you get all the other things that you need. That's what trade is all about. That's the specialization that makes rapid economic productivity possible, because it means that we all increase our skills and our investments into the areas that we are already better at. And we constantly face competition, so we have to upgrade our skills, we have to update our methods, our technologies. So it creates this positive circle whereby we get access to the brains and the hard work of everybody else. That's what exchange is about. So it's about not being limited to your own talents, but using everybody else's. And it's incredibly important, not just economically, but also in terms of harmony between cultures, populations, and countries. And one of the most problematic aspects of the Trump presidency is that he had this idea that the world is a zero-sum game. If somebody else gains, it must be because I lost. And yes, historically, that was often the case. If the other tribe was successful, it was probably because they stole stuff from you. But the great thing about free trade is that no deal ever happens unless both parties think that they gain from a particular exchange. And when that happens, the success of somebody else is not a threat to me. The success of Poland is not a threat to Sweden. It was in the 16th century. We were afraid of Poland and thought that if you were successful, you could kill and steal from us. Now your success, upgrading your scientific capabilities, technological innovations, means that we have more things, a larger pool of goods, services, technologies, ideas from which to gain peacefully. And that's what creates at least the potential of more harmony, of more peace. The moment we begin to think that we are one another's enemies, that is deeply problematic, not just economically, but also for our mindset and the potential to create more positive circles and more international harmony and peace in the future.
Thank you. And I am glad that you also mentioned this non-economic aspects of openness, this potential that we gain thanks to open world. And I think we still have a lot of missed potential because many places are not so open. One aspect of openness is, of course, openness of the borders. And today, during COVID-19, one popular thing that we are all using is food delivery. Yesterday, I used the American app to order food from Spanish tapas that was delivered by Michael, who came to Poland from some African country. And I think more and more people in Poland now, through this way of ordering food, have some real life contact with migrants. Nevertheless, we still have a lot of stereotypes in Poland, and Poland, since the Second World War, has been a very homogeneous country. It was opening after 1989, and we had big wave of migrants from Ukraine, for example, in the last few years. And migrants are important part of our economy and important pillar of our economic success, of our progress. So could you tell us why open borders matter and why also people are scared of migration and immigrants, while they in general are a source of good thing, because everyone should like progress?
Yeah, immigration is really, the argument is really the same for trade, but only more, I would say. The ability for people to be present, to improve their own lives by being present and creating new work, new ideas for us here in real time. It deepens specialization, the division of labor, and the pool of ideas that's accessible. Often we're hostile because we're unused to it. There is some cultural legacy there. If we're not used to people who look different, speak in a different manner, have a different culture, we are initially hostile. I think that's our Stone Age brains at work. But there is also a very clear historical pattern that if they are allowed to integrate into our economies in our society, we get used to them after a while because we see the kind of benefit that they're doing. And interestingly, there is a correlation between the number of immigrants in the area where you are and long-term tolerance to immigration, whereas hostility is the largest, where you only see them on television or hear about them on social media. So you never get to meet them and understand that they are not this different other, but they are also like you. They are parents, they cheer for your sports team, they are hardworking laborers who improve your options and your abilities. In small scale, when, for example, we see food delivery services, but also large scale, because different ideas have to meet and combine to create new ideas. That's really what creativity is about. We always have a tendency to group think, to think like others do around us. It's different to stand out, but people who come from another culture, they often look at our old problems from a new perspective. We just got the results from Pfizer's vaccination trials against COVID-19. And interestingly, they use technology from a German company that was founded and led by two immigrants and children of immigrants from Turkey, Muslim immigrants to Turkey, who came up with this new idea on how to use biotech to vaccinate in a new kind of way. It might be that the neighbors looked at them in a strange way. Who are they with new strange methods? But it might just be that they are the ones who saved the planet from this pandemic. And that tells you something about how we need the strange fits and strange combinations to come up with something brand new. And the more people who experiment with strange ideas, the greater the chance that one of them is going to come up with that wonderful new idea.
You've just mentioned wonderful, good ideas that are brought to us by openness. And one big global challenge that we see now everywhere is the topic of global warming and climate change. And you also write about potential solutions that can be brought by openness to this type of problems. Could you tell us more why openness matter for challenges like this?
Yeah, of course, we need new ideas and new technologies to deal with global warming. Nothing else is going to work. We have had this debate on whether we should shut down parts of industrial society and stop flying and stop with long distance trade and so on. You know what? We just did that. We shut down the entire world for 6 months or something like that. So how much did that result in lower carbon emissions by the end of the year? Well, according to the latest data that I saw from the International Energy Agency, it will decline in 2020 by no more than 8%. 8%. So despite the fact that we threw the world into a global depression and we increase extreme poverty by probably 100 million and increase hunger around the world dramatically because we shut down trade and production on this massive scale, it only reduced carbon dioxide emissions by 8%. And that really tells you that that's not the solution to shut down things. The solution is better technologies that makes it possible for us to produce more with less. And that always comes from new ideas and from new scientific breakthroughs and technological innovations that does that. And we have plenty of them. We've got new and better methods to catch solar energy. We have new fascinating blueprints for fourth generation nuclear that could be both safer, simpler, and cheaper than ever before. We have genetically modified algae that might be able to give us very green biofuels in the future. We have the ability to catch carbon dioxide out of the air through industrial processes and put them, for example, in the Saharan desert, where we can use solar to power these plants. So there are so much stuff going on there. And it only happens because we have this international cooperation where we compare best ideas and we use the best technologies wherever they happen to come from. So that's really about international scientific cooperation and competition, and about being allowed to use those technologies wherever they come from. So it's a story about openness to new ideas and technologies rather than stopping the world.
In your book, you also write a lot about the human nature. And on the one hand, Homo sapiens, you write, is a cooperative species and trader by nature. But on the other hand, people have these psychological predispositions that push us towards tribalism and authoritarian ideas, especially when we feel threatened, when we have some security issues. So why do we develop this internal struggle and different attitudes? And one more question to this: do you also see some, even personal exercises that we can do to struggle with our internal divisions?
Yes, this is the problematic double nature that we have. Human beings came so far. We conquered the world because we're experts in cooperating. We're able to communicate and share ideas and exchange ideas and favors and services constantly. So we're not alone. We can make use of everybody, and that's fantastic. That's how we solve problems. But unfortunately, we probably developed this skill partly to kill and steal from others, because the moment we develop these skills, the intelligence, the communication, the cooperation ability, human beings got to the top of the food chain in nature. So no animal could ever threaten us again. The only thing that could threaten us is other human beings, other tribes who cooperated in a better way, and the risk was always that they would do it to defeat us, because historically we've had this warfare between different tribes and different groups. So it has created in us both these parts, both the ability to find new ways to cooperate with others, but also this constant worry that others might be out there to get us and to destroy us. So we're very worried about groups and where our group fits in with the other group. And often in times of crises, as you mentioned, we see this, because then whatever the crisis is, it could be a Great Depression or a natural disaster or a pandemic, it triggers that Stone Age part of our brains that thinks it's almost like a fight or flight reaction. We want to flee from the problems behind walls and tariff barriers, or behind a strong man who protects us, or just pick fights with scapegoats or with other nations. Unfortunately, in the modern world, the threat is not the other invading tribe. It could be a virus, or it's a lack of innovation, and in that case it doesn't make sense to kill the threat or the sort of the others, the foreigners or whatever, but to learn from them, to cooperate with them, and to exchange, to come up with better ideas on how to deal with those problems. But that doesn't help, because we still have that part of human nature. So what do we do about it? Well, there are ways, even though it's always part of human nature, it's pre-wired, but it's not hardwired. It's a default setting, but its default is not destiny. It's not the end of it all. We can think things through. We can count to 10 and learn from how we work psychologically, and understand that this is my fear. This is my panic talking. This is the tribal part of my brain talking. I could learn more about that group, for example, or of individuals in that threatening group, and understand that they're much more alike. And one of the things that have extended historically this circle of respect and empathy with others is to recognize ourselves in others and see that they have something in common with me, even though we might be different. For example, I've learned that there are other historians or classical liberals or people who love Star Trek or Dostoevsky in other countries. And that teaches me that we have something in common. The most important thing is not how we look in the language we speak. And that's an important exercise to all of us constantly, I think. And that's happening everywhere. You can see that right now going on in the American election. Many of the kind of authoritarian populists on the Trumpists side are beginning to realize that many Hispanics actually voted for Trump because they like some of his message. And then they learn, so, oh, not all Hispanics and Latinos are the same. They are different individuals with different interests and different ideas, and some of them I really like. Well, in that case, the most important thing is not that you are of European ancestry or Mexican or the first language you have.
Thank you, Johan. We are struggling now with the pandemic and restrictions connected with COVID-19, and you mentioned COVID-19 in your book. But my guess is that you started writing the book before the pandemic. Does the virus change anything about your thinking about the openness and progress? And aren't you afraid that many countries might want to be more closed due to current crisis related to the virus?
Yes, I'm afraid of that. And even though I started writing exactly as you suggest before the pandemic struck, one of the points that I had already made was that pandemics historically creates this societal fight or flight instinct among people. Often it leads to undermining long distance trade, seeing foreigners and minorities as scapegoats, and wanting to be protected by a strong man or a big government to take care of us all. So, and in a way, it's the dream of every author to see current events unfolding in a way that makes your book relevant, but perhaps not when you write about the end of civilization and of openness and the potential for that. So in a way, this pandemic has strengthened my fear that this will increase the backlash against openness and globalization. And I think we've seen that in some areas. Many who are more worried about openness than they've been before. On the other hand, to me, it's a perfect example of why we need openness in two different ways. The first one being that now we see a real life global example of what happens when we undermine trade, production, migration, flying. In a way, right now we're living in a dream world of Donald Trump and Greta Thunberg in combination. No migration, no flights, no trade. And the result is it's miserable. It's a global depression. It's unemployment. There are calculations saying that around 1 million children will die, according to Johns Hopkins study. 1 million children will die this year because of the dramatic collapse of the global economy, and then increased poverty and hunger. So it tells you that sometimes you only notice what you have when it's gone. So we put globalization on hold and global capitalism on hold for 6 months, and the result is terrible. So that's one of the lessons, I think. The other lesson that reinforces why we need openness is that the only way to combat this is international cooperation and exchange. And that has been made possible faster than ever now, thanks to globalization. Chinese researchers could, in less than a week, use technology developed on the other side of the globe to read the genome of the virus and then publish it online for everybody to see, so that researchers in Berlin could, in just 6 days, come up with a test that could be used all around the world to find out who's got COVID and who doesn't. And then when you have that information, drug companies and hospitals and researchers can begin to poke the virus and find out its vulnerabilities, and therefore come up with drugs and potentially a vaccine. And we've seen that now. And again, a combination of Turkish migrants to Turkey in cooperation with a US drugs manufacturer, one of the few that did not take part in Donald Trump's sort of government-oriented warp program with subsidies to all the drugs manufacturers. They came up with this in a record period. You know, it took 3,000 years for mankind to come up with a vaccine against polio. But now it seems like it didn't take more than 3 months for mankind to come up with a vaccine against COVID-19. So even though openness has been undermined by the pandemic, I think that we have also learned that openness is the way that will save us all and get the world back on its feet.
Our think tank is very involved in historic education about communism and transition. And I agree with you that it's good that now we have a real life examples about closed borders or even rationing because of, you know, short problems with toilet paper and pasta in some supermarkets in March or April. So when we teach kids now, we can show them, you know, real life examples of problems that were permanent problem under communism in Poland and many other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. I would like to ask you the last question. And as I said, I represent a think tank, Civil Development Forum, a member of the Atlas Network. And in our think tank business, we often think about policy recommendations. So what lessons for policies we can find in the book and in this idea about openness as a source of progress?
I would then, and I'm glad that you're action-oriented and no one to take away from this. I will give you one broad principle from which I think it follows many policy implications. And that one is that the most important thing for our societies to function and to continue to make progress against our most challenging problem is openness to surprises. That's the major thing. The thing that's gonna take care of us, create solutions to the pandemic, to global warming, to the new industries that will employ people in the future, that will come from strange places that we hadn't considered before. It will come from areas or individuals whom would never have been taken into consideration by a big plan or by a Politburo. That's when we look at the history of all important innovations, basically, they come from there. So opening up those opportunities for more people and from more places and for more exchange, that's the overarching mission. And what kind of policy implications does that entail? Well, for example, it means that when you're looking for new innovation, the most important thing is not to try to point to particular companies or particular technologies, but to make sure that the road from vision or crazy idea to implementation is as short as possible, that it's not the grand plan, the big sort of government warp program for it, but instead removing the obstacles on the way, the long time lags for permission requirements, the many different sets bureaucratic procedures that it takes to test new technologies, for example, so that more people can use their local knowledge, their local individual knowledge and ideas to come up with new solutions and not being blocked in particular ways. That would be the one overarching principle, I think, when you think about policies ahead.
Thank you. Our time is over. So if our audience would like to learn more about what we were talking about, you can find the book by Johan Norberg, Open, The Story of Human Progress, on Amazon and other places online. And thank you, Johan, for your time, for joining us at the Freedom Games, and stay healthy in this time of the pandemic.
Thank you so much, and good luck, and enjoy the rest of the games.
Thank you.